Inside vs outside, the myth of the perimeter. Opening, setting the stage. There is a story that used to get told in every security training deck, and it went something like this. Your network is a castle. The firewall is the wall. The internet is the hostile land beyond it, full of bandits and siege engines, and your job is to build the wall high enough and watch the gate closely enough that nothing bad ever gets inside. Once you were inside, once you had a badge, a domain-joined laptop, an IP address on the corporate subnet, you were one of the good guys. You were trusted. Nobody asked you to prove yourself again at every door. That story was comforting. It was also, for a very long time, mostly true, or true enough that pretending otherwise wasn't worth the trouble. And then it stopped being true, not all at once, but the way a wall crumbles, a crack here, a crack there, until one day someone leans on it and it's not there anymore. Here is the uncomfortable question underneath all of this. If a contractor can walk into your building, find an empty conference room and plug a device the size of a credit card into an Ethernet jack behind a potted plant, and that device instantly has the same trust as the CFO's laptop, what exactly was your firewall protecting? The answer is that it was protecting the perimeter. It was never protecting the inside. And once someone is inside turns out to be a very dangerous place to have blind faith. This is the idea we're going to sit with for the rest of this session. There is no inside anymore, not in any meaningful security sense. The moment you accept that, your entire mental model of where the danger lives has to be rebuilt from the ground up. The foundation, why the wall stopped working. To understand why the perimeter model failed, you have to understand what it assumed, because those assumptions are exactly where the cracks formed. The castle and moat model assumed that your assets lived in one place, your data center, your office building, your server room, and that everything worth protecting sat behind a single defensible boundary. It assumed that the people who needed access to that boundary were physically present, walking in through a door you controlled. It assumed that the number of entry points was small and countable, so you could put a guard or a firewall at each one and call the job done. None of those assumptions hold anymore, and they stopped holding for reasons that have nothing to do with security teams doing their jobs poorly. They stopped holding because the business itself changed shape. Applications moved to the cloud, which means your data center is now scattered across infrastructure you don't own, sitting behind someone else's walls, reachable from the public internet by design. Employees started working from home, from coffee shops, from airports, which means the device accessing sensitive systems is no longer inside any building you control. It's wherever the employee happens to be standing. Contractors, vendors, and third-party integrations multiplied, each one another entity that needs some form of access without being a permanent, badge-carrying employee. And mobile devices, phones, tablets, personal laptops under bring-your-own-device policies, blurred the line between corporate asset and random device on the internet almost entirely. Once you add all of that together, the perimeter isn't a wall anymore. It's a fog. You cannot draw a clean line around inside because your assets, your users, and your access points no longer live in one place. And here is the part that makes this genuinely dangerous rather than just inconvenient. The old model didn't just fail to keep up. It left behind an assumption that is actively exploited by attackers every single day. The assumption that anything already inside the network doesn't need to prove itself again. This is where network segmentation becomes relevant as a concept, and it's worth defining clearly because it's foundational to everything that follows. Network segmentation is the practice of dividing a network into smaller, isolated zones so that a compromise in one zone doesn't automatically grant access to every other zone. Think of it as building interior walls inside the castle, not just the outer one. Without segmentation, A flat network means that once an attacker gets a foothold anywhere, a phishing victim's laptop, an unpatched printer, a forgotten test server, they can move laterally to reach anything else on that same network with minimal additional effort. Segmentation matters because it limits blast radius. It doesn't stop the initial compromise, but it stops that compromise from becoming a total one. A well-segmented network turns a single breach into a contained incident. A flat network turns a single breach into a total loss. The DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone, was the traditional industry's first real attempt to grapple with the idea that not everything inside should be trusted equally. A DMZ is a network segment that sits between the untrusted public internet and the trusted internal network, typically hosting systems that need to be reachable from outside, a public web server, a mail relay, while keeping those systems isolated from the truly sensitive internal assets. The thinking was reasonable for its time. If a public-facing system gets compromised, the attacker lands in the DMZ, not in the internal network where the real data lives. But notice what the DMZ actually reveals when you look at it closely. It's an admission, baked into the architecture itself, that outside isn't the only threat. It's the industry quietly acknowledging that you need a buffer zone even for systems that are only semi-trusted, which means the binary of inside good, outside bad was already cracking decades before anyone said the word zero trust out loud. The DMZ was the last honest attempt to draw a line between inside and outside. Everything after it has been an admission that the line doesn't really exist. The structural tension, trust versus verification, convenience versus containment. Every mental model worth teaching has a tension sitting at its core, and this one is no exception. The tension here is between operational convenience and continuous verification, between a system that lets people get their work done without friction, and a system that assumes nothing and checks everything, every time. The old perimeter model optimized entirely for convenience once you were inside. You authenticated once at the gate, and after that you moved freely. This felt efficient. It felt like trust, and trust feels good. It's fast, it's low friction, it doesn't slow anyone down. But trust granted once and never re-examined is exactly what an attacker is counting on. The entire discipline of lateral movement, the set of techniques an attacker uses to expand from an initial foothold to broader access, exists because internal networks historically trusted by default. An attacker doesn't need to breach your firewall a second time once they're inside. They just need to look like they belong, and if belonging was never verified continuously, looking like you belong is trivially easy. The new model, the one built around the idea that there is no safe inside, optimizes for containment and verification, and it pays for that with friction. Every access request gets scrutinized. Every device gets checked for posture and health before it's allowed to talk to anything sensitive. Every user, no matter how senior, no matter how long they've worked there, gets asked to prove who they are again and again contextually based on what they're trying to reach. This is safer. It is also, undeniably, slower and more complex to build and to live inside of. This tension doesn't resolve. It's not a problem you solve once and move past. Every architectural decision in this space is a negotiation between how much friction the business will tolerate and how much blind trust you're willing to leave sitting around for an attacker to inherit. Keep that tension in view as we walk through the rest of this, because it's the thread that ties the tools, the implementation choices, and the failures together. The architectural philosophy, zero trust as the answer to a dead assumption. If the myth of the perimeter is the diagnosis, zero trust architecture is the treatment. The core principle can be stated in 5 words: never trust, always verify. But the phrase is almost too clean, too much like a slogan, and slogans have a way of getting nodded at in a meeting and then not actually implemented. So let's slow down and take it apart. Zero trust means that no user, no device, no application, and no network location is trusted by default, regardless of where that request originates. It doesn't matter if the request is coming from a laptop plugged into an Ethernet jack in the actual corporate headquarters, 3 feet from the CEO's office. It doesn't matter if the account making the request has 15 years of tenure and has never once been flagged for anything suspicious. Every access request is evaluated fresh, against a set of contextual signals. Who is asking, from what device, in what state of health, from what location, at what time, trying to reach what specific resource, before a decision is made to grant or deny. This is a genuine philosophical break from the castle and moat model, and it's worth being precise about what changed. The old model asked one question once: are you allowed through the gate? The new model asks a version of that question continuously, for every single resource, every single time. Zero trust doesn't eliminate the concept of the DMZ so much as it makes everything a DMZ. Every internal application is now treated the way you'd treat a public-facing web server, assumed reachable by hostile actors, and therefore requiring its own independent verification layer rather than inheriting trust from the network it happens to sit on. What does this look like architecturally? The traditional VPN, which grants a user broad access to the internal network once they authenticate, gets replaced by zero trust network access, sometimes implemented through an identity-aware proxy. Instead of connecting a user to the network and letting them roam, ZTNA connects a user to one specific application, after verifying both the user's identity and the device's health, and grants nothing else. If that user needs to reach a second application, that's a separate, independently evaluated request. The blast radius of a compromised credential shrinks dramatically, because compromising one login no longer means inheriting the keys to everything reachable on that subnet. The traditional firewall, which inspects traffic crossing the boundary between inside and outside, what's called north-south traffic, gets supplemented, and in mature architectures largely superseded in importance by microsegmentation, which inspects traffic moving between servers inside what used to be considered the trusted zone, east-west traffic. This matters enormously because most sophisticated intrusions don't stay in one place. An attacker lands on one host and then needs to reach a database server, a domain controller, a file share. If nothing is watching or restricting that internal east-west movement, the attacker moves as freely as a legitimate administrator would. Microsegmentation treats every server-to-server conversation as something that has to be explicitly permitted rather than implicitly allowed, because both machines happen to live on the same internal network. Trust based on domain join, the old assumption that a machine belonging to Active Directory is inherently a trusted machine, gets replaced by trust based on real-time device posture, typically enforced through endpoint detection and response telemetry. A domain-joined laptop that hasn't been patched in 6 months, that has a disabled antivirus agent, or that is exhibiting anomalous process behavior is not the same trust level as a domain-joined laptop that is fully patched, actively monitored, and behaving normally even though both machines would have looked identical to the old model. Domain membership tells you about administrative enrollment. It tells you nothing about the current health of the machine, and health, not enrollment, is what should drive trust. And trust in the physical network itself, the assumption that anything with an IP address on the internal Wi-Fi or wired network deserves default access, gets replaced by 802.1x and network access control, which require every device attempting to join the network to present a verifiable identity, typically a certificate, before it's allowed onto anything beyond an isolated holding segment. This is the direct answer to the Raspberry Pi problem, and we'll come back to it in detail in the capstone scenario. But the principle is worth stating plainly here. A network port should not grant trust simply because it exists inside a building you own. The building is not the security boundary anymore. Identity is. Tools and the trade-offs they carry. Every tool in this space is a materialized decision, and materialized decisions have costs. Understanding these tools deeply means understanding not just what they protect against, but what they cost to deploy, and critically, what they still fail to cover even once they're running. Consider Zero Trust Network Access, or ZTNA, delivered through an identity-aware proxy. What it gives you is precise, application-level access control that doesn't depend on network location. A remote employee working from a hotel Wi-Fi network gets exactly the same security posture as one working from headquarters, because access is brokered per application rather than granted at the network level. This eliminates the old VPN problem where a single compromised credential handed an attacker a foothold on the entire internal network. What it costs you is significant upfront engineering work. Every internal application has to be cataloged, fronted by the proxy, and integrated with your identity provider and your device posture signals. Legacy applications that were never built to sit behind a modern identity-aware proxy, ones using outdated authentication protocols, or ones that assume they can trust any traffic arriving from the internal network, often need rework or compensating controls before they can be safely migrated. And what it does not cover, even when fully deployed, is the machine-to-machine traffic that has no human identity behind it at all. A backup job talking to a file server, a monitoring agent polling an API. These are exactly the kind of non-human identities that get forgotten during a ZTNA rollout, because the architecture was designed with a human sitting at a keyboard in mind. Consider microsegmentation. What it gives you is containment of lateral movement. An attacker who compromises one workload cannot simply hop to the next one, because the network itself refuses to carry that traffic unless it's explicitly permitted. This is one of the most effective controls against the ransomware spreads across the entire file share infrastructure scenario, because it limits how far an initial compromise can travel before it hits a wall it wasn't authorized to cross. What it costs you is operational complexity that scales with the size of your environment. Defining and maintaining the policy, which workload is allowed to talk to which other workload, on which port, for what purpose, is a continuous exercise, not a one-time project. Environments change constantly. New services get deployed, old ones get decommissioned, and every change is a potential policy update. What it does not cover is anything that happens within a single trusted segment. If two workloads are both inside the same microsegment, because the policy grouped them together, an attacker who compromises one has unrestricted access to the other. Microsegmentation is only as good as the granularity of the segmentation itself, and granularity has diminishing returns against increasing management overhead. Consider 802.1x combined with network access control. What it gives you is a hard requirement that any device, wired or wireless, must present a verifiable identity before it's allowed past an isolated holding network. This directly closes the physical access gap that the old model ignored. The assumption that a device plugged into a wall jack inside your building is automatically trustworthy. What it costs you is certificate lifecycle management at a scale most organizations underestimate. Every laptop, every VoIP phone, every printer, every badge reader, every conference room television needs an identity certificate, and every certificate needs to be issued, renewed, and revoked correctly. What it does not cover on its own is device health. 802.1x answers the question, is this a known, authorized device? But it does not answer, is this known device currently compromised? A domain-joined, properly certificated laptop that has been infected with malware sails through 802.1x without a flicker of resistance, because 802.1x was never designed to evaluate behavior, only identity. Consider network detection and response, or NDR, deployed to monitor internal east-west traffic rather than just the traditional perimeter. What it gives you is visibility into lateral movement that a perimeter-focused firewall would never see, because that traffic never crosses the perimeter at all. It stays entirely inside what used to be considered the safe zone. NDR builds a baseline of normal internal communication patterns and flags deviations. A workstation suddenly talking to a domain controller it's never contacted before. An unusual volume of traffic between two servers at 3 a.m. What it costs you is the tuning burden. Internal networks are noisy, full of legitimate but unusual-looking traffic, backup jobs, batch processes, administrative scripts, and an NDR deployment that isn't carefully tuned generates enough false positives to bury the genuine signal. What it does not cover is anything encrypted in a way the sensor cannot inspect, and modern internal traffic increasingly is encrypted by default, which means NDR often has to rely on metadata and behavioral patterns rather than payload content, giving you strong anomaly detection but weaker forensic certainty about exactly what happened inside that encrypted session. None of this is an argument against deploying these tools. It's an argument for deploying them with your eyes open, understanding that each one closes a specific gap left by the myth of the perimeter while leaving its own gaps behind, gaps that the next layer of the architecture has to account for. Implementation, building the no-safe inside architecture. Theory earns its keep in implementation, so let's walk through what it actually takes to build toward this model, using two scenarios that show the non-obvious considerations. The first is deploying an internal intrusion detection capability specifically to catch lateral movement, which is a fundamentally different exercise from deploying a perimeter IDS. A perimeter IDS sits at the boundary and watches traffic entering and leaving, a well-understood, well-bounded problem. An internal IDS has to be placed thoughtfully across multiple internal segments, typically fed by mirrored traffic from switches sitting between the segments you consider highest risk. The segment where user workstations live, the segment where servers live, the segment where domain controllers and other high-value identity infrastructure live. The goal isn't to catch the initial breach. That's the perimeter's job, imperfect as it is. The goal is to catch what happens next. An attacker who has already landed on a workstation attempting to reach systems it has no legitimate reason to talk to. This means your detection logic has to be built around a baseline of what normal internal communication looks like, which requires you to actually understand your environment's traffic patterns before you can meaningfully flag deviations from them. You cannot detect lateral movement in a network you haven't first mapped. The second scenario is rolling out ZTNA for a hybrid workforce, and this is where the implementation gets genuinely hard, because it exposes an assumption that architects frequently get wrong, the assumption that every access request has a human being behind it. When a large organization begins enforcing identity-aware proxy policies across its internal applications, a predictable failure pattern emerges almost immediately. Some applications become unreachable, and not because the security model was wrong, but because the rollout didn't account for what was actually talking to what. Diagnosing this kind of failure requires working through it in layers, and it's worth walking through the diagnostic process explicitly rather than just naming the fix. First, you check whether a policy exists at all for the affected application. A surprising number of these failures trace back to an application that was simply never cataloged during the discovery phase, When default deny enforcement kicks in and no explicit allow policy exists, the application silently stops being reachable, and the first anyone hears about it is a help desk ticket. Second, if a policy does exist, you check device posture requirements. If the application is being accessed from a device that doesn't meet the posture bar, missing an EDR agent, running an outdated OS version, failing a compliance check, the request gets blocked at the device evaluation layer before it ever reaches the application-level policy. And this can look identical to a policy misconfiguration from the outside, even though the root cause is entirely different. Third, and this is the layer most rollouts get wrong, you check for non-human identities, service accounts, scheduled batch jobs, monitoring agents, backup processes. These were previously trusted implicitly because they originated from inside the perimeter. Nobody had to think about them because the network they lived on was assumed safe. Under zero trust enforcement, that implicit trust disappears, and a service account with no certificate, no MFA capability, and no posture signal attached to it simply has nothing to present when asked to verify itself. It fails, and it fails silently, because nobody built a verification pathway for an entity that was never designed to prove who it is. The lesson underneath both of these implementation scenarios is the same one. You cannot enforce a no-safe inside model on an environment you haven't mapped first. Enforcement without discovery is how you turn a security improvement into an outage. When the perimeter myth bites back, the troubleshooting lens. Understanding the theory is one thing. Recognizing, in the middle of an active situation, that a perimeter-era assumption is the actual root cause of what's going wrong requires a different kind of muscle. Let's work through two failure scenarios in full diagnostic depth. The first scenario. A workstation is showing clear signs of botnet infection, periodic outbound connections to what turns out to be a command and control server, at regular intervals, consistent with beaconing behavior. The perimeter firewall, which has an A+ rating on every external audit the company has ever commissioned, did not stop this. How did a perfectly rated perimeter fail to prevent an internal compromise? The first thing you check is how the infection actually arrived, because the firewall failed is rarely the accurate framing. The firewall did exactly what it was built to do, which is inspect traffic crossing the network boundary. If the infection arrived via a phishing email that a user opened, or via a malicious attachment, or via a compromised website visited during ordinary browsing, then no perimeter firewall configuration was ever going to stop it, because the malicious payload rode in through a channel, email, or an outbound web session initiated by the user, that a perimeter firewall is specifically designed to allow. The firewall's job was never to stop every possible way malware enters an organization. Its job was to control traffic at the network boundary, and email and outbound web browsing are traffic that boundary is supposed to permit. This is the first crack in the myth made visible in a single incident. A perfect perimeter score tells you almost nothing about your actual exposure, because most modern compromises don't breach the perimeter at all. They walk through it, disguised as ordinary traffic the perimeter was designed to allow. The second thing you check, once you understand how the infection landed, is what happened after it landed. And this is where the myth of the perimeter does its real damage. Once that workstation was compromised, what stopped it from reaching the domain controller, the file server, the finance database? In an environment still operating under castle and moat assumptions, the answer is often nothing. The workstation sits on the same flat internal network as everything else, with no segmentation, no micro-segmentation policy, and no internal detection watching for anomalous east-west traffic. The infection's ability to beacon out to its C2 server and potentially pivot further inward isn't a failure of the perimeter. It's a failure of the assumption that once you're past the perimeter, nothing else needs to check you. The remediation here operates on two tracks simultaneously. Immediately, you isolate the infected host at the network level, pull it into a quarantine VLAN, preserve it for forensic analysis rather than simply wiping it, because understanding the initial infection vector matters for preventing recurrence. But the durable fix is architectural, not tactical. Deploy internal network segmentation so that a compromised workstation cannot reach the domain controller or the file server without crossing an explicit, monitored boundary, and deploy internal detection capable of flagging the beaconing pattern itself, independent of whether the destination IP is on any perimeter block list. The deeper lesson is that a company can pass every external audit with a perfect score and still be one phishing email away from total compromise, because the audit was measuring the wall, and the actual battle was fought entirely on the other side of it. The second scenario: an administrator reviewing access logs notices something that shouldn't be possible. A standard user account has logged directly into a domain controller. No privilege escalation alert fired. No automated system flagged it. The administrator only caught it because they happened to be looking. How do you investigate this, and what does it reveal about the internal trust model? The first thing you check is how that standard account was even permitted to authenticate to a domain controller in the first place. Because in a properly configured environment, standard user accounts should have no legitimate reason to interactively log onto that tier of infrastructure. This usually traces back to overly broad group policy, a legacy administrative group that was never cleaned up, or, very commonly, a permission that was granted years ago for a specific one-time task and never revoked afterward. This is privilege creep, and it thrives specifically in environments that trust the internal network by default, because nobody feels urgency about tightening internal permissions when the internal network itself is assumed safe. The second thing you check is what that account actually did once it was on the domain controller, because the presence of the login is the symptom, not the full picture. You pull authentication logs, look for credential dumping tool signatures, check whether any scheduled tasks or services were created, and check whether the account attempted to access the NTDSDIT file or LSASS memory, both of which are common objectives for an attacker who has reached a domain controller and is looking to harvest credentials for the entire domain. This is the single most consequential lateral movement failure an organization can experience, because compromising a domain controller often means compromising the trust anchor for the entire identity infrastructure. Every account, every group membership, every trust relationship the organization depends on. The third thing you check, and this is the part that connects directly back to the mental model, is why no automated detection caught this before a human happened to notice it manually. In a network still operating on perimeter-era trust assumptions, internal authentication events, especially ones originating from inside the trusted network, often receive far less scrutiny than external ones. An external login attempt from an unfamiliar country gets flagged instantly. An internal login from a standard account to a domain controller, coming from a machine sitting on the corporate LAN, frequently doesn't, because the entire monitoring posture was built around the assumption that internal traffic is inherently less suspicious. The fix is to explicitly tier your infrastructure, treating domain controllers and other identity-critical systems as a protected zone that requires privileged access management, just-in-time elevation, and mandatory alerting on any interactive login by anything other than a small, explicitly authorized set of administrative accounts, regardless of whether that login originates from inside or outside the traditional perimeter. The deeper lesson is one worth sitting with. Privilege escalation inside a network with no internal trust boundaries isn't really escalation at all. It's just movement, because there was never anything internally in the way to escalate past. The job role lens, how different roles live this trade-off. The same principle looks different depending on where you're standing when you encounter it. Let's walk through how three distinct roles experience the death of the perimeter in their day-to-day work. The security architect encounters this at design time, and their central challenge is translating "there is no safe inside" from a philosophy into an actual buildable architecture that the business can afford and operate. When this architect is asked to implement network segmentation for an operational technology environment, the industrial control systems that run physical processes like manufacturing lines or utility infrastructure, they are making a very deliberate decision to treat that OT network as its own high-security zone, separate even from the rest of the internal corporate network, because OT systems often cannot tolerate the same security controls as IT systems. They can't always be patched on a normal cadence. They sometimes can't run endpoint agents at all, and an aggressive network scan can, in rare but real cases, disrupt a safety-critical process. The architect's job here is to draw a boundary around that OT environment specifically, because the rest of the internal network can no longer be assumed safe enough to let OT traffic mingle with it. The corporate network, once considered the trusted core, is now just another zone that needs to be kept at arm's length from the most sensitive systems in the building. This is the myth of the perimeter applied recursively, even inside what used to be called inside. There are now zones that must not trust each other. The detection engineer encounters this at the moment of building the actual alerting logic, and their central challenge is designing detections that assume the perimeter has already been crossed. When this engineer builds a command clustering pipeline that combines SIM data with EDR telemetry specifically to catch lateral movement patterns, they are explicitly designing for the scenario where the firewall has already been evaded. The detection isn't asking, "Did something bad cross the boundary?" It's asking, "Is something moving between internal systems in a way that doesn't match how legitimate administrators or services actually behave?" This requires building a behavioral baseline of internal traffic, which is a fundamentally different and harder problem than perimeter detection, because internal traffic is dense, varied, and full of legitimate but unusual-looking activity. The detection engineer who only builds rules for perimeter crossings is, in effect, still defending the castle wall while the real fight has moved to the courtyard. The SOC analyst at L2 and L3 encounters this at response time, under pressure, and their central challenge is that internal traffic used to get a pass that it can no longer afford to get. When this analyst is investigating anomalous traffic from an internal host beaconing out to a known command and control server every 10 minutes on port 443, they cannot treat this as a lower priority event simply because the source is internal. Under the old model, internal to external beaconing from a workstation might have been deprioritized in favor of chasing external to internal attack attempts, on the flawed assumption that anything already inside had already passed whatever scrutiny mattered. The analyst working from a no-safe inside posture treats that internal host with exactly the same seriousness as a suspicious external connection attempt, because the beaconing traffic is itself proof that the internal-external distinction stopped mattering the moment that host was compromised. Their contain and eradicate plan has to move fast precisely because that host, sitting comfortably inside what used to be the trusted zone, now has a direct line to systems that everyone assumed were protected simply by being on the same side of the wall. The common thread across all three roles is this: the myth of the perimeter doesn't just change what tools you buy. It changes what each role is watching for at design time, at detection building time, and at response time. Every one of them has to stop asking, "Is this coming from inside or outside?" and start asking, "Has this been verified right now for this specific request?" Because the first question stopped being a meaningful signal the moment the wall came down. Case scenario: the Raspberry Pi in the conference room. Let's bring everything together with a scenario that has real stakes and a constraint that cannot simply be engineered away. A mid-sized financial services firm has just come off an external penetration test and a compliance audit with a result their CISO is genuinely proud of. Their perimeter firewall configuration earns an A+ rating. Their public-facing web applications pass every scan clean. Their DMZ is properly segmented from their internal network. By every traditional measure the industry has trained this organization to care about, they are secure. 3 weeks later, a contractor arrives to do routine maintenance work in one of the firm's conference rooms. Nothing suspicious on the surface. A legitimate vendor with a legitimate work order. During a break in the work, that contractor plugs a small single-board computer, a Raspberry Pi roughly the size of a deck of cards, into an unused Ethernet jack behind a credenza in the corner of the room. The jack is live. The switch port has never been configured with any access restriction beyond basic connectivity. Because it's a conference room, nobody thought of it as sensitive infrastructure. The moment the Pi connects, it receives a DHCP address on the internal network. And because internal network membership has always implied trust in this environment, it now has line-of-sight reachability to the same data center segment that hosts customer financial records. This is the constraint that cannot be engineered away. Physical access to a building cannot be reduced to zero. Contractors, vendors, delivery personnel, and guests will continue to have legitimate reasons to be inside a corporate facility, and no amount of badge policy or visitor escort procedure eliminates the possibility of a 5-second window where an unattended Ethernet jack becomes reachable. The firm cannot solve this problem by making the building impenetrable. They have to solve it by making the network refuse to extend trust based on physical location at all. You are the security architect brought in after this gap is identified. Discovered, in this case, not through an actual breach, but through an internal red team exercise that deliberately replicated exactly this scenario to test the firm's assumptions before a real attacker did. Your task is to apply the myth of the perimeter as a design principle and close this gap without breaking the legitimate business of the conference rooms, which do need functioning network access for video conferencing equipment, guest presentations, and everyday employee use. The core of the solution is 802.1x network access control, deployed across every switch port in the building, including the ones that have historically been treated as an afterthought: conference rooms, break rooms, any location where a device might plug into a wall jack. Under this model, no device receives meaningful network access simply by virtue of being physically connected. Every device must present a valid identity certificate before the switch will move it out of an isolated holding VLAN and into a segment with any actual reachability. When the contractor's Raspberry Pi connects, the switch sees a device with no certificate and no recognized identity. It has nothing to authenticate with because it was never issued anything. It's a foreign device with no relationship to the firm's identity infrastructure at all. The switch automatically places that port into a dead VLAN. No route to the data center, no route to anything of value. And critically, an alert fires to the SOC the moment an unrecognized device attempts to join the network from that physical location. But you don't stop at the technical control, because the trade-offs here are real and need to be documented and managed, not ignored. The first trade-off is complexity. Managing certificates for every legitimate device in the building, laptops, VoIP phones, printers, badge readers, conference room displays, is a meaningfully larger operational burden than the plug-in-and-go model the firm operated under previously. Every new device needs to be enrolled. Every certificate needs a renewal cycle. This is not a project you finish once. It's an ongoing operational discipline. The second trade-off is the risk of legitimate lockouts. A laptop whose certificate has expired, or a new employee's device that hasn't been enrolled yet, will find themselves without network access at a moment they don't expect. And if this isn't handled gracefully, it creates exactly the kind of friction that drives shadow IT and workaround behavior. An employee tethering to their phone's hotspot because the secure network locked them out, which quietly recreates a new, unmonitored gap in the very perimeter you were trying to eliminate. The mitigation for that second trade-off is MAC authentication bypass, used deliberately and narrowly as a temporary failover for legacy devices that genuinely cannot support 802.1x, certain older printers, some specialized industrial equipment, combined with strict device profiling so that MAB doesn't quietly become a backdoor of its own. Every MAB exception is documented, time-limited where possible, and reviewed on a defined cadence, because an exception process that never gets revisited is how a hardened architecture slowly grows soft again. You document the entire decision explicitly, the residual risk that MAB exceptions represent, the operational cost the IT team has accepted in exchange for closing the physical access gap, and the review cadence, quarterly in this case, at which the certificate infrastructure, the exception list, and the segmentation policy will be reassessed against new devices, new office layouts, and new attack techniques. This isn't paperwork for its own sake. It's what makes the decision defensible later, when someone asks why the firm chose this particular balance of security and operational friction rather than some other one. The outcome, when the red team repeats their test 3 months later with an identical Raspberry Pi in an identical conference room, is different in exactly the way that matters. The device connects. It receives no meaningful network access. It has no path to the data center, no path to customer records, nothing to talk to at all beyond the dead VLAN it's been dropped into. And within 90 seconds, the SOC has an alert showing an unrecognized device attempting to join the network from that physical port, with the location, the timestamp, and the port identifier all attached. The firm's perimeter firewall rating hasn't changed. What's changed is that the firm stopped believing the perimeter firewall rating was ever the whole story. There is no safe inside anymore, and for the first time, the network itself agrees. Closing what you carry forward. The next time you're asked to describe your network's security architecture, and someone asks whether the internal network is trusted, resist the pull toward a comfortable yes. The honest answer is that nothing on your network should be trusted simply because of where it's plugged in, who badges into the building it sits inside, or how long it's been sitting there quietly, unquestioned. Location was never a security control. It only felt like one for a long time because the alternative, verifying everything continuously, was harder to build and harder to justify. The wall you grew up trusting was never wrong to build. External threats are real, and a strong perimeter still matters. It's simply no longer sufficient, and it was never meant to carry the entire weight of your security posture alone. What changed is not that walls stopped mattering. What changed is that the space behind the wall stopped being a place you could afford to stop watching. Carry this forward. The question is never, is this coming from inside or outside? The question is, has this been verified right now for exactly what it's trying to reach? Ask that question of every device, every account, every service, every single time, and you will have finally let go of the myth, the comforting, dangerous idea that there was ever a safe inside to begin with. End of session, mental model. Inside versus outside, the myth of the perimeter.